Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first book talk of 2024, Finding Edward with Sheila Murray. My name is Meredith Jordan, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Stakeholder Outreach here at TMU. We are really excited to gather here today to hear more about this debut novel, which has been called Remarkable, Powerful, and a Touchstone. Before we begin, I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the nature and people who lived on the land where our university is located today. At the university, we have made important commitments to reconciliation, and I invite you to learn more about this work online and in person the next time we can get together on campus. A couple of quick reminders. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to rewatch it and share it once it has been posted to our website. And if you have any questions for today's speakers, please type it into the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to get to those near the end of the session. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to the author of Finding Edward, Sheila Murray, and the moderator for today's event, Dr. Sheila Teeklucksingh. Dr. Cheryl Teeklucksingh. Sheila is a multifaceted talent. She is a writer, a documentary filmmaker, a TV sound editor, and since 2012 has worked in the social justice, not-for-profit sector, and now leads a grassroots, volunteer-driven initiative that engages urban residents in adaptation to local climate change impacts. Her novel, Finding Edward, was a finalist for the 2022 Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction, was named one of the best works of Canadian fiction in 2022 by CBC Books, and it won the Hamilton Literary Award. It was a Toronto Book Awards finalist and also on the Canada Reads 2023 long list. Sheila's writing has been supported by the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council. She was born and raised in England and now lives in Hamilton, Ontario. We're very proud to call her a two-time alumna, as she has a BA in journalism and an MA in immigration and settlement studies from TMU. Welcome, Sheila. Dr. Cheryl Teeklucksingh is a professor and the department chair of sociology here at TMU. Her research over the last 2 decades has focused on examining the relationship between environmental justice in Canada and concerns for social inequality. She has participated in the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, in Canadian Institutes of Health Research funded grants, and has authored numerous publications in the areas of environmental justice and racialization in Canada. Welcome, Cheryl. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Cheryl to get us started.
Thank you, Meredith, and hello to our author, Sheila. I should mention that Sheila was a former graduate student in my class in the Immigration and Settlement Program, so it's just a real honor to be here with Sheila. Before we jump into our talk today, I'd like to provide our audience with a bit of a background about this fantastic book. Finding Edward is a novel about a man called Cyril Roundtree, who discovers letters from the 1920s that reveal the story of a white mother who gave up her mixed-race son, Edward, for adoption. Cyril has recently moved to Toronto from Jamaica and was abandoned by his own white father, so Edward's story intrigues him. He begins to search for Edward and the truth about what happened to him. Along the way, he discovers hidden pieces of Canada's Black history and gains the confidence to take on his own new world. Now I'm going to start with a few questions, and we'll hopefully have some time for the audience questions at the end. So for our audience, if there's a chance for audience questions, can you please put your questions via the Q&A function? So let's start talking about this fantastic book. Let's start off by talking about this book, how this book came about and why you decided to write it.
I'd better unmute myself. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you, TMU. I had to get my mouth around that. I went to Ryerson, and everyone who's joined us today. Really appreciate the interest. And it's great to be talking to Cheryl again. And I'm thinking back, Cheryl, to one of the reasons I think perhaps I began to sort of frame this book was my experience with immigration and settlement studies, because in a couple of ways. One was that we spent time looking at a history of immigration in Canada, and at the hidden histories. I mean, there was so much there. There's so much there that the general the Canadian population does not know still, absolutely. And of course, it would be impossible to know it all. But it was really, it really intrigued me. And then I do remember in a classroom with you, you asking us in the early class to consider our social location. And I had never done that before, and I'm pretty sure that no one else in the class had that. So this is back, for listeners, it's back to in 2010 or 2009, 2008, I guess, somewhere. So a long time ago. And that was a challenging question. I think people are a lot more familiar with it now. But it really got me thinking about what that sort of personal immigrant experience is in Canada. So I appreciate all of that. And then I think too, I spent, my dad was Jamaican, my mother was English, and I was raised in England. But I had a very good, spent a lot of years in the last part of my parents' life back and forth to Jamaica. And of course, my dad had worked for the Jamaican government. So I was very conscious of that very strong relationship between Canada and Jamaica, but there's definitely a power differential, and Jamaicans are very aware of that. But at the same time, feel, I think, a kind of cousin connection to Canada. And of course, there are lots of Jamaicans here, and lots of Black folk from all sorts of places around the world as well. So those were a couple of the things that got me started. And then I think I wanted the two sort of major themes that I carried with me as I wrote the book. One was, what does it mean to be mixed race in Canada? I identify as Black because I'm asked to identify as something or other. Mixed race doesn't necessarily, and there are boxes for it these days, but ultimately I'm a Black woman. But with a whole diversity of kind of, bits and pieces that make me. So I didn't answer that question in the book, certainly, but it was with me the whole while, which is why both characters are mixed race. That's pretty obvious. And then the other theme for me was how so much changes, and yet nothing changes.
Right. Okay. So the next question is about the setting. So the book takes place mainly in the Toronto area, including the TMU campus in 2012. Why did you choose this specific location and this year to tell the story?
Yeah, I think the location, I went to Ryerson, so I had in my head, I had all of those images that I knew what the cafeteria looked like. I knew what that wall where the kids met up looked like. I had a very strong sense of that campus, and so that's where after my main character Cyril, the young man, arrives in Toronto, and finally makes his way to university. It seemed the obvious place to put him. I also wanted to be, I've located him in Western Mount Dennis, which is a sort of inner suburb of Toronto. And that's where he lives. But I wanted him very much to have a relationship to the downtown area, which I am very fond of. So that was important. And also, he needed to be puzzling out how he belonged. And this is going to sound biased, but I'm going to suggest, I think there's more to puzzle out downtown than there is out there.
Right. So you've already said a little bit about this, but if you can sort of expand on it. So like Cyril, you immigrated to Canada as a young person. Were Cyril's impressions similar to your own?
Mine were very different. So there's no autobiography in this story. Because I came from a majority white country, I mean, that's the experience I grew up with. Cyril came from a majority Black country. And so understanding that he had a place, a sort of preconceived place from, from a white perspective, was a point of, I think initially a sort of revelation for him. And then he had to figure out how to make that fit with who he was. Also, I came at a very different time, and I came with my family. So I didn't have any of these challenges particularly. And then in terms of the sort of racism that Cyril encounters, which is for the most part, I think, quite subtle, but with the occasional sort of full force experience. I was aware of systemic racism, certainly, but it wasn't something that directly affected me when I arrived. And I'll say the last thing about the difference is that I came with a British accent at a time when Brits were really fashionable, and the kids at school would ask me to please say something with your English accent. It's so cute, and I would reply, but you people have accents too, So it was a very different sort of relationship, which is not to say that for other people my age in school at that time, it could also be a really challenging and really difficult experience. So I was one of the luckier ones, I think. And then I'm conscious, Cheryl, that I didn't quite completely answer your previous question, which asked me about why I set the novel in 2012. And I would like to answer that, thinking now the difference between when I arrived, and in fact, I went to a big high school, and there were very few people of color there. In fact, I could count them, I think, probably on one hand. And one of them was my sister. That high school now, I think, would be probably 75% people of color, I imagine. When Cyril arrives in Toronto, it's 2012, and I've kept it there for a number of reasons, but most particularly because it predates Black Lives Matter. And while Toronto is for sure now a very multicultural place, and it was when Cyril arrived, certainly growing in that sort of representation. Black Lives Matter, I think, would have made a big difference to his sort of ambiguity about taking on any sort of, making any sort of social or political serious criticism of what was expected of him. So I kept it there. I make a point in the novel that he's reticent about sort of joining up with other young people who are really engaged in the sort of political discussion about what it means to be Black in Canada, and particularly following a shooting that happens on the campus. But it's still ambiguous enough that it allows Cyril to puzzle through, whereas Black Lives Matter might have, with the force that it had when it arrived, might have sort of just upended him and had him sort of thinking, okay, I understand it. I'm Black. This is my position. I need to stand up to what might be pushed at me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that context is so helpful, and particularly if we think about this being the tail end of Black History Month, and the place that, as you said, that Black Lives Matter has had. If we're to switch a little bit and sort of dig into the storyline, I think the storyline that's really intriguing is the relationship between Nelson, who has such a powerful influence on Cyril's life, and he kind of encourages him to what makes his heart sing. Did you have someone who was a key influence in your life in that same sort of way?
I love that question, because nobody's nobody's ever asked me that, and I don't know where it came from. I think it came from Nelson.
Mhm.
You know, there's this remarkable experience when you're writing fiction, where characters sort of develop and take on a personality and say things that are sometimes quite surprising. That's a lovely question to be asked, and I think we should all ask ourselves that with some regularity and make sure we're on the right place. But so no, there was no one in particular, but I was certainly, I think, very conscious of the fact that when my parents retired to Jamaica, because they didn't live there as a, my dad left when he was 18, and so he was 65 or so when he went back to live. And that's the Jamaica I know, that period after their retirement, really over the next 20 years, actually. But where, you know, the power goes out very regularly in here. They were in a small market town. The power goes out with great regularity. Next door to them was living a housekeeper, somebody who was left in the house to take care of it by a family who generally lived abroad in Florida. Jamaican family living in Florida. And so she was there alone with her daughter, raising her daughter. And her daughter figured out that on her own, took it upon herself to, when the power went out at their house, which would happen because sometimes the electrics hadn't been paid, or I think most often because the electric bills hadn't been paid. She would come to my parents' place and knock on the door and ask to come study at that dining room table if the power was on there, or you know, in candlelight. My parents would sort of set things up so that she could continue to do her homework, which she was pretty determined to do. And she adopted them. She adopted them as her gran and gramps. And to the degree that my dad eventually put a gate in the fence that separated the two properties so that she could come and go when she wished. And I think that relationship between my dad, Ozzy, and Erica is perhaps where Cyril and I'm thinking it must be where Cyril and Nelson come from. And certainly at my parents' house, Erica would have had lots of exposure to things like classical music and poetry and so on, that she wouldn't have had from her mother next door. So you know, it has to come from there, doesn't it? My dad never said, "What makes your heart sing?"
Oh, what a lovely relationship. I
Yeah,
can see how you could draw from that.
yeah.
I think everybody is keen to know the next question about whether or not you have another book in the works and what's next for you, since you're involved in so many exciting projects.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. I am working on a new novel, and I'm really excited about it for a number of reasons. I mean, another reason that the book was set in 2012 is because I actually was writing it back then. It took a long time to find a publisher. Went out to a number of publishers and agents who, you know, sort of took it on, looked at the synopsis, were enthusiastic about reading, and then eventually declined. So it took time to find the publisher. So one of the real pleasures from the book, having had the attention it has had, is knowing that whatever I write next will get read pretty quickly. And if it's good, it'll get published. I mean, I think I feel pretty certain about that. So it's a whole different experience to write something knowing that it has a life after the manuscript. Hopefully, if it's good. So there's that, and then I because I work in climate change, I work with a grassroots organization that works with low-income urban high-rise dwellers for the most part, looking at climate impacts. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about climate change, and this book is an opportunity to put together climate change with migration, with human migration, and to do it, I hope, in a really engaging way with, I hope, very interesting characters. So I'm so looking forward to having the time to sit down and write. And to apply all the lessons that I've learned from having written now a book and been through, I think, a good 3 drafts. That in itself is a great experience, and to have been guided by some some terrific readers and a great editor.
Okay, with the next question, I'll actually integrate a question from somebody who's in the audience along with sort of asking you what advice you would have as somebody who's making, great progress in the creative industries, what advice you would have for current TMU students and grads, and someone in the audience kind of related to that is asking, how did you feel that your journalism background helped you to write in terms of something that's nonfiction?
Okay, those are great questions. And I to answer the journalism piece first, yes, that was tremendously helpful. In fact, I had been writing before I went back to as a mature student, obviously, to university, and I enrolled in the magazine writing stream in journalism. And that's where I truly rediscovered my love of writing, in writing literary journalism. So I loved it. And then I was ready to start writing. Fiction is rather more freeing. Off you go. So I never really did work as a journalism, although I did do some documentary filmmaking as well. But it's certainly most important to the in the context of writing this novel, Finding Edward, because it explores hidden Black histories, or forgotten Black histories across this country. It was very, very important to me to be certain of their accuracy, so that every historical figure who is mentioned in the book was exactly as I've described, as Cyril finds him, because Cyril does a lot of. I'm sort of, doing this research on Cyril's behalf. So what Cyril finds, Cyril and I found together. And then, of course, Edward lived some of those, was alive through some of the history that's told in the book. But very important for me to be accurate about that. And that's journalism training, I'm sure. And then as for what advice I might have for other folk, I think I'm not the person to advise. I've done a number of things, but never with any sort of career ambitions. I've done things pretty much on my own terms, and so I'm no model for anybody's sort of career. But what I can say is, I never expected to be enjoying a novel, a published novel, at this point in my life. It's a real joy. And so I guess what I can say is just, if it's calling to you, go do it and see what happens. And life is hopefully long, and all sorts of things can fit in there.
Well, I think you're being very modest about your role as a role model now with such an accomplished novel. Just in terms of turning back to the book, is there an excerpt or a quote that you thought you would like to leave us with?
I would read from the book, but I'm aware of time. I have my shortest reading is about 3 minutes, and it might drift to 4. So I don't think I can really do that. But what I can say to people is, if I could, I would be reading to you from a section in the book where Cyril, who has been in Toronto for, I think at that point around 12 weeks, a short period of time, staying with a family friend, sort of crammed into a place where he doesn't belong there either. And then comes a day when he makes a decision and about moving. And the important thing to know about Cyril is that he again didn't come to Jamaica, to Toronto from Jamaica, armed with the ambition that so many other young people have. And it is a sort of armor. It doesn't tries to keep what's really troubling out while the focus is on making it work, getting through, getting to that first job, earning the money to either start making a life right here and now in this country, or making enough money to be able to send it home to support a family, which in Cyril's case was his immediate need. So I would read to you from that first big decision he makes in Jamaica to in Toronto to do something for himself that will serve himself, which is move. And then I would also read, if I could, a section about Edward arriving in Africville, Nova Scotia. And I think a number of people are familiar with Africville, but for those who are not, it was one of the many Black settlements, certainly in Nova Scotia, but across this country. And Black people have been in the country since the 1700s. So these places have long histories. So I would read to you from Edward's arrival in Africville, which I just loved to have seen. Unfortunately, the city of Halifax took it down, so it's not there anymore.
Yeah, that connection between the immigrant today and the historical context was so powerful. There's a question that has come in from someone that says, I'm a writer having some publications in magazines. How did you find a publisher, and what challenges did you face? And how do you suggest an inspiring author to publish their first work? Lots.
Well, as I said, it took quite a number of years for me to get mine published. And I'll tell you how it happened, because this may be helpful. So as I said, I'd sent it out to publishers and to agents, and it was met generally with some enthusiasm, I think because it was a Black story probably, but not the Black story they were expecting. And so it was declined. And some years, and so that's over a period of some years. And I'd given up. I really had given up. But a friend of mine, who happened to be a literary friend, but she knew about the book because she'd seen me at readings. She'd never read it, but she'd seen me read from the book. And so when she had lunch with my now editor publisher, and he asked her whether if she knew of anybody whose work he should look at, she said me. So I guess what I would say then is go to readings, read when you can, and keep writing those short stories, and apply for grants, and take all the encouragement you can get where you find it.
That's wonderful advice, Sheila. It's been so wonderful having the opportunity to chat with you about this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila and Cheryl, for that discussion. It was so interesting. And I want to thank you to our audience for being here with us today. So look out for an email from us with a link to where the recording of this book talk will be posted next week, so you can rewatch it and share it, and for more information on where you can purchase the book if you haven't already read it. Until next time, thank you, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.